During a meal, a young girl notices something horrifying. Her mother's reflection in the mirror is covered in blood. Terrified, she turns to look at the familiar face beside her. The woman immediately senses something is wrong and stares back. The girl dares not respond to the woman's questions, her gaze fixed on the terrifying reflection. Yet when her mother follows her line of sight, she sees nothing unusual.
Seitu, aren't you dead?
Her mother quickly tries to calm her. It turns out that several months earlier, during a turbulent flight, Katerina was left shaken. But now, her mother's comforting words only deepen her dread. Katerina vividly remembers the plane crash, how the aircraft plummeted and everyone on board perished. Except for her, the sole survivor. Her mother grows impatient after repeatedly failing to reassure her and takes away her plate in anger, threatening to punish her. Katerina says nothing, she only stares at her mother washing dishes. Moments later, her mother begins to change. Katerina tries to call out, and wakes up from a nightmare. Years later, Katerina's childhood trauma resurfaces when she is forced to board a plane again. As a child, she had survived an unforgettable plane crash. During that flight, the plane encountered severe turbulence. Young Katerina heard someone whispering and turned to see an old witch muttering incantations. When the witch opened her eyes, her pale, lifeless pupils terrified Katerina. Moments after the incantation ended, the plane's engine exploded, sending it into a spiral of thick smoke before it crashed. Everyone on board died except Katerina. She never knew if the witch caused the crash, but the horrifying experience kept her from ever flying again. Now, however, the sudden death of a loved one leaves her no choice but to fly home. Alexei, noticing her unease, said that flickering lights during takeoff were perfectly normal. But Katerina still felt restless after hearing this. Due to the severe weather, all flights were delayed except for this one, which took off on schedule despite the snowstorm. Katerina wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. An elderly woman, overcome with fear, called for the flight attendants, demanding to leave the plane. The flight attendant, of course, refused such an unreasonable request. With so few passengers on board, the commotion quickly drew everyone's attention. As a doctor, Katerina stepped in to calm the woman, offering her 2 anxiety pills. The elderly woman finally settled down, but after returning to her seat, Katerina felt even more on edge. Unable to calm herself, Katerina went to the bathroom, secretly took 2 pills, and splashed her face with water, forcing herself to relax. But when she looked up, her surroundings had completely changed. Cautiously, she opened the door and found herself back in her childhood home. Her mother's voice echoed through the house, warning her to get off the plane. Katerina listened closely and realized the voice was coming from one of the rooms. She opened the door only to find herself back in the airplane cabin. Assuming it was just a hallucination caused by anxiety, she tried to dismiss it, but the warning words echoed in her mind, leaving her deeply unsettled. Katerina felt as though someone was watching her. When she turned around, the shadowy figure was already gone. She had no choice but to return to her seat. And at that moment, the plane surged upward, climbing through the storm. Elsewhere, a man in the front row also sensed something strange. He noticed a passenger staring at him.
Is that me you're drawing there?
When he confronted the passenger, they ignored him and instead focused on a drawing in their lap. The man assumed it was some kind of performance art and dismissed it, unaware that the drawing depicted his impending death. Suddenly, the plane began to shake violently. The flight attendant quickly announced that they had hit turbulence and instructed everyone to remain in their seats. The turbulence reignited Katerina's anxiety. Alexei tried to reassure her, while an elderly man comforted his wife. But in the next moment, the elderly man's face contorted in pain, his body convulsed, and after a brief struggle, he collapsed entirely. Hearing the cries for help, the flight attendant rushed over, and the few passengers on board also gathered around. Noticing the man's pale face, Katerina quickly directed the others to lay him flat on the ground and began performing CPR. But suddenly, the man's eyes snapped open, pale and lifeless. He sat up abruptly, grabbed Katerina by the collar, and uttered a strange incantation before collapsing again. To Katerina's shock, no one else seemed to have seen what had just happened. They continued trying to revive him as though nothing unusual had occurred. The man began convulsing again. Alexei, noticing Katerina's shaken state, tried to call her over, but Katerina was frozen in horror. From the last row, a ghostly figure slowly emerged. Moments later, the elderly man took his final breath. Before anyone could react, the plane shook violently again. This time, the turbulence was even more severe. triggering the release of the oxygen masks. The flight attendant quickly strapped Katerina, who was searching for her daughter, into her seat, then grabbed a spare oxygen tank and rushed over to help. She found that the little girl had already put on her mask by herself, but the next second, the turbulence sent the flight attendant flying into the ceiling, knocking her unconscious. Katerina could barely focus on helping. The thin oxygen in the cabin made her vision blur, and she felt herself losing consciousness. In a daze, she was transported back to the day of the childhood plane crash. This time, Katerina clearly heard the witch's murmurs identical to the words the elderly man had spoken before his death. When Katerina regained consciousness, the plane had stabilized. She quickly ran to her daughter, calming her down. The flight attendant, though shaken, also got back on her feet, and together they moved the elderly man's body to the last row. Katerina turned to her daughter, still visibly frightened. To distract her, she handed her paper and a pen, encouraging her to draw, but as she prepared to stand up, she noticed that the scar on her leg, left from the plane crash years ago, had completely disappeared. Katerina told Alexei about all the bizarre occurrences, speculating that the witch had caused the last plane crash and had now returned to claim her life. Alexei dismissed her fears, saying that everything happening could be logically explained. The plane was simply experiencing turbulence. The old man likely died of a heart attack, and there were certainly no witches on board. He also mentioned that he had seen Katerina secretly taking medication earlier, suggesting that her anxiety in similar situations were causing hallucinations. With no other choice, Katerina returned to her seat. However, her unease intensified when she saw her daughter's drawing. It depicted the two of them sitting in the very last row, row 19, the same row where Katerina had seen the shadowy figure earlier. At that moment, Alexei suddenly complained of a headache, unaware that the plane's air conditioning system was now inexplicably leaking alcohol above him. The passenger directly beneath the leak also felt the effects. Clutching his head in pain, he reached up to shut off the vent, but the alcohol kept dripping. With the plane's turbulence worsening, the leak intensified, and everyone failed to notice the oxygen tank rolling near the man's feet, hissing as it leaked gas. Meanwhile, Katerina realized something troubling. Despite the chaos, the captain had not made any announcements to calm the passengers. Turning to check on her daughter, she was horrified to see the girl seemingly talking to someone, but there were no other children on the plane. Katerina quickly looked back, but the shadowy figure vanished once again. At that moment, an emergency announcement blared. Due to the worsening snowstorm and in-flight incidents, the plane would divert to the nearby Machivo airport. Hearing this, Katerina was overcome with dread. It was the exact same destination as the doomed flight from her childhood. The daughter beside her began to panic as well. She heard the whispers of the little girl again. The voice said that once a man caught fire, her mother would leave her. At the same time, the man, already agitated after hearing about the emergency landing, couldn't hold back any longer. He pulled out a cigarette, ready to break the rules and light it. Just then, Katerina finally spotted the oxygen tank. The man's actions instantly reminded her of what her daughter had said, but it was too late to stop him. The cigarette ignited the alcohol surrounding him, and in seconds, the man was engulfed in flames, the fire fueled by the oxygen. Alexei immediately grabbed a blanket to cover him, and a flight attendant rushed over with a fire extinguisher, but it was too late. The man was reduced to a charred husk. The string of deaths made Katerina even more certain of her suspicions. The other force seemed to share her realization and accelerated its killing spree. The elderly woman, who had remained silent since her husband's death, suddenly stood up, smiling faintly, and walked toward the restroom. At first, Katerina didn't pay much attention, but when the woman failed to come out after a long time, she felt something was wrong and hurried to knock on the door. Hearing the commotion, the flight attendant unlocked the restroom door with a key, only to find it completely empty. The elderly woman had mysteriously vanished mid-flight. Even stranger, the flight attendant insisted that there was no elderly woman on this flight at all and sternly warned Katerina not to scare the other passengers with nonsense. Katerina's mind spun into chaos. She turned to look at the elderly man's body only to see his pale eyes snap open. The next moment, the body suddenly jerked upright, startling Katerina into stumbling backward. Before she could regain her balance, ghostly hands reached out from under the seats, grabbing her body. Struggling, Katerina instinctively looked up and realized she was in the infamous row 19. Her consciousness began to fade. In a daze, she returned to the scene of the plane crash from her childhood. As the witch chanted her incantations, Katerina felt herself falling into a deep sleep, hypnotized. When Katerina woke up again, all the strange occurrences had vanished. The old man still sat slumped in his seat, his face deathly pale. Katerina realized that staying in the cabin was dangerous. She rushed back to her seat, grabbed her daughter, and tried to flee to the cockpit. Her frantic behavior frightened those around her. Alexei quickly stood up to stop her, but the next moment, blood inexplicably dripped from the corner of his eye. This further confirmed Katerina's suspicions, but the flight attendants weren't about to let her cause more panic. As they tried to restrain her, one of the attendants suddenly began convulsing. A torrent of water gushed from her mouth, as though she were being drowned by an unseen force, and she collapsed lifelessly to the floor. Seeing this, Katerina no longer hesitated. She grabbed her daughter and ran, but in the next second, she saw that he had already drawn the flight attendant's death in advance. Shocked, she rushed forward and snatched the sketchbook, only to find that all the previous bizarre events had been drawn out as well. Just as Katerina questioned him about what was going on, he inexplicably burst into flames and burned to ashes before her eyes. The remaining 2 passengers tried to convince Katerina not to open the door to the cockpit, but the more they tried to stop her, the more Katerina believed that it was the real exit. However, no matter how hard she tried, the cockpit door wouldn't budge. As the 2 passengers approached again, seemingly to reveal the truth, one of them was suddenly dragged into the darkness by a mysterious force. Alexei's head then began to bleed profusely, and before he could say anything, he collapsed, dead. The horrific events left the mother and daughter completely broken, but seeing her terrified daughter, Katerina knew she had to be strong. She rammed the door repeatedly, and this time, it miraculously opened only to reveal another identical cabin. Katerina realized these were illusions created by the witch. She grabbed her daughter and pushed forward, determined not to stop. But when she opened the next cockpit door, the same scene appeared again. They kept running, passing through door after door in a desperate attempt to escape. Finally, after an uncountable number of doors, the cabin ahead of them grew bright. But to her horror, Katerina realized that her daughter was no longer by her side. She spotted the ghostly figure standing next to her daughter. Without hesitation, she ran toward them. The world around her suddenly froze. Then, the witch's voice echoed through the emptiness. It turned out that everything Katerina had experienced for the past few decades was merely a dream. In reality, she was still on the plane moments before the crash. The witch explained that she had cast a spell to put Katerina to sleep so the child wouldn't experience the terror of dying. She intended for Katerina to pass away peacefully while living out a fulfilling life in the dream. However, the witch hadn't expected Katerina's will to survive to be so strong. She fought relentlessly to wake up. Now, the dream had reached its limit, and the witch hoped Katerina had found a way to save herself. At that moment, Katerina finally understood the truth. In reality, the elderly man died of a heart attack, just as in her dream. As a doctor, Katerina rushed to check on him. In the real world, only a few minutes had passed, but to Katerina, it had been 30 years of vivid, lived experiences. She realized why her daughter had always told her she would leave, because the daughter wasn't real. Now, her daughter could no longer hold her back, but she had shown Katerina the way to survive. Looking at her seat, Katerina finally understood the significance of row 19. The next moment, little Katerina woke up from the dream. The cabin was in chaos as the plane violently shook. She crawled toward her mother, but then, the wing exploded again, tearing a massive hole in the cabin. The elderly woman was ripped from her seat and sucked out into the sky. Soon after, the flight attendant was also pulled out. Little Katerina struggled to reach her unconscious mother, desperately signaling for her to move to row 19. But in the next moment, her mother was knocked unconscious by the turbulence. Katerina's small frame wasn't enough to lift her mother. Alexei, seeing this, risked everything to help. With his assistance, they finally made it to row 19, but just then, Alexei was struck in the head by a piece of shrapnel, killing him instantly. Moments later, the plane lost control and plunged toward the lake. Everyone on board perished in the crash. The site was littered with shattered wreckage, but the tail section, having a smaller impact area, miraculously remained intact. The mother and daughter, seated in row 19, survived against all odds. Little Katerina had successfully saved her mother, but the cost was enormous. She now had to carry decades worth of memories and experiences in her small, childlike body as she continued to live in the real world.